Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Owen King's The Curator is a spellbinding Dickensian fantasy of illusion and mystery set in an unnamed city in the midst of a revolution where nothing and nobody is as it seems. An intrepid former domestic servant named Dora is our guide to this strange city as she embarks on a secret quest to discover what caused her beloved brother's mysterious death. Owen King is the author of the novel double feature, and We're All in This Together, a novella and stories. He's the co-author of Sleeping Beauties with his father, Stephen King. His new book is The Curator, and we welcome Owen King back to the Book Show. Owen, thank you very much for being with us. What a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure's all mine, Joe. I'm thrilled.
This book is so incredibly satisfying because there's so much to it. There's so much meat on the bones, and I'm interested in the creation of that world, of that time, of that place, of how that came to you. I understand this originally came from a short story that you wrote. And when did the alarm bell go off of, oh, this is something that I could work with on a much larger scale?
I had written this short story way back in 2014, and it's just about one very important but small part of the novel, and it's about the main character who thinks of herself as Dee. She's Dora to everybody else, but Dee gains the curatorship of this strange little museum on this obscure little street for reasons that are not entirely clear at first. I had written that story, and it had a lot of some of the action involving all the things that happen on the street and all the things that happen between Dee and her lover, Robert, who was a lieutenant in the Revolutionary Army. So that stuff was there. It was a long short story. It's about 40 pages. Throughout it, there's all this revolution and change happening in the background of the story, and it sort of gets gestured at in very broad strokes. And after I had written the story, it was quite different from things I had written before. It was sort of a mix of a kind of Victorian drama and also, a very dark fantasy kind of story. I thought about that and people reacted so positively to it. I really felt that I understood all the things that were happening elsewhere in the story, and that was important stuff and interesting stuff and an opportunity to make all the characters that I had already written about more interesting and explore them and build up a whole additional cast of characters that I was excited about, and to also try something that I hadn't tried before in my books. I'm a pretty restless writer. I feel like I've got to do something really different every time, and I love Victorian novels, Dickens and Trollope and Elizabeth Gaskell, and I love the way that they spread out and tell these stories that are about a society from every place in that society, every level of prosperity, every corner, every nook. I love that kind of storytelling, and I love those books, and this was an opportunity for me to try something like that. So it expanded a way that the nut of the story was there, even though it was just 40 pages. And the book itself is almost 500, but quite a lot changed. Quite a lot changed.
It's fascinating to me because it's set in this Victorian city, somewhere, 1890, 1900, somewhere around there?
That's exactly. Yeah. And I mean, the nice thing about creating your own city in your own time, in your own sort of alternate Earth, is that you can be a little loose with some of the historical elements. There's no cars, but there's electricity and phones, and there's a mix of things. But 1890, 1900 is really what I was thinking of.
I said it in the introduction, but this book is very Dickensian. You said it too. There is that feel to it, and yet your voice comes out loud and clear as well, which makes sense since you wrote it. But the fact that there is that Victorian feel, and yet the contemporary ideas and a little snark and that seem to permeate as well.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want it any other way, honestly. When when I write something, I try to read away from other things like it. I did a lot of research while I was writing the book, but my old standbys of things like Great Expectations and Little Dorrit and Bleak House, those kinds of things,
Right.
those went way in the back of the shelf for the 3 or 4, or how many years it was that I was working on this, because I wanted to have my personal feeling for those kinds of voices, but I didn't want to actually read those kinds of voices, so that hopefully what the reader gets is a book that has like a little bit of an echo of those Victorian novels, a little bit of the texture of them, maybe, but also is contemporary in its feel, which it would have to be. I think if I tried to imitate Dickens and Trollope and Elizabeth Gaskell and, Wilkie Collins and authors like that, I think that it would not work. I love reading those books and I can lock in really quick. They're my favorite books, in fact, but I don't write with that many clauses
Right.
or that there's just an expansiveness that's in the language itself, not just in the stories that they tell. And I'm a lot less. I don't have that kind of tool in my kit. I think very few people do.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, that's
Yes,
an amazing thing to compare to, because you pick up Great Expectations, and it's just you open up, and by the third page, you're like, "Good God, how did
I know. It's like, how could
everyone
he do
write
it?
this?" Right. It's
How could he do it by hand? I mean, and obviously there was a process involved, but people say dismissively, the people who don't like Dickens, for instance, they'll say dismissively, "Oh, he wrote by the word." But my experience of reading those novels, I don't get bored, and I don't feel that there's some sort of dance going on to distract me from a plot that could be taken care of in 200 pages. I never feel that way. I always feel like all those little touches and digressions end up paying off in interesting ways that add to the whole of it. And it amazes me because I can't fathom writing anything that amazing to begin with. But I also, when you think about doing it on a deadline,
right.
boy, it's just, it boggles the mind. What a genius.
Owen King is our guest on this week's book show. The new book is The Curator. It is published by Scribner. You had the skeleton, you had the bones, and then you start adding on the meat. You set this up for a good long time before we get ready to step our toe in and really bathe in it.
There is a lot of setup in the book, and I hope that's to a lot of people's taste, because I know it's not to some people's taste, and which is fine. That's everybody's different. But the way that it's set up is we meet Dee at the beginning of the book, and this coup has just occurred, and with the help of her lover Robert, but mostly through her own cunning, she contrives to gain the curatorship of this little museum, and her reasons for doing so are complex and only hinted at initially. As things go along, we find out that Dee isn't exactly who we think she is. In fact, there's quite a lot to her that we don't know. And the museum has a lot more to it. The museum's the National Museum of the Worker, and it doesn't seem like anybody's been there in a long time. And the street that it's on has a lot more to it than we initially realized. And the revolution isn't exactly what we thought it was when we began the book. And so the structure is kind of like a series of mystery boxes. And I don't know,
Mm.
probably some of your listeners saw Glass Onion, and they remember the mystery box from the beginning of the film. And at least one person just smashes apart to get to the thing in the middle. There's no way to do that in a book. So you either have to enjoy that or have a little patience, but it all does add up. And I hope that people find that kind of winding road enjoyable, and like the people that they, or at least are interested in the characters that they meet along the way.
Well, it's fascinating because you offer such detail and you bring us down this road, and you constantly wonder where exactly we're going. And then when you get a sense, that is just a wonderful moment. And then it continues, and as you say, it may not be as it appeared or what it seemed like. And that's one of the fun things I think about reading this. Did you always know what those right and left turns were going to be? Because it comes off a bit like improv.
I knew most of the stuff. Conspiracy is and there is a lot of conspiracy in this book, is tricky to write about because by its very nature it tends to be pretty elaborate.
Right.
That's why conspiracy is hard to believe in, because it is so elaborate. It took a lot of planning, and things didn't always lock into place quite the way I initially imagined them, but I was always able to find a way, and did a lot of outlining as well about where things should go. Some things ended up seeming not so important, so I took those out. It was tricky, but one thing that was fun about it, there is a degree of improvisation even inside an outline, where you create a character and they're so interesting it feels like they should play a bigger part. And then you
Mm.
think about, well, how would that happen? And oftentimes that provides the solution to a narrative knot that you've made for yourself. That character can come along and cut it for you, and it serves two purposes, which you get to spend more time with this character that you think is interesting and that you think readers will find interesting, and also solves a plot problem.
Of course, it's you writing this, but is there a point where the work kind of takes over and says, okay, this is what this wants to sound like. This is what this wants to be.
I think the whole thing is like that, in the sense that inspiration is a little bit nebulous for me. There's lots of inspiration in the book from research I did into Victorian life in various cities,
Mm-hmm.
and from Victorian novels that I read. I mean, just, the most obvious and straightforward one is that Dora is a domestic servant, and that's a very intentional gesture towards Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Little Dorrit, Amy Dorrit, is a domestic servant who does needlework for Mrs. Clennam in Little Dorrit, and finds herself enmeshed in a pretty elaborate conspiracy herself. But there's stuff that just pops into your head, and you think to yourself, "Wow, that would be really fun," or images that you find occurring to you, and they help tell the story. I don't think about it. There's nothing magical exactly about it. It's just some way that my brain works, or that any writer's brain works, I think. There's lots of things in the book that have a contemporary feel, in the sense that it's about a society where there's a lot of shenanigans and a lot of corruption at the top, and a lot of very well-meaning people fighting very hard to figure out how to make things better, but running into problems that are unexpected and vast. And I do think that that is a very direct expression of how I look at our world today. So that part of it, for sure.
Would this be a different book if you were writing it 10 years ago, minus the fact that you have matured as a writer?
It's funny. I think a lot of times when a writer says that they enjoyed themselves writing a novel, I get a little nervous, right? Because it's like, what sort of metafictional, you know, fun did they have here at
Right.
the expense of my poor mind? But in this case, I hope that's not true, because I did have lots and lots of fun writing this, and tried to go about it with a lot of confidence, and I hope that translates in a positive way. I mean, I think you try to write the book with a lot of confidence, and then you try to go back through it in a really cruel way and plane down the round spots so that it's all, going straight forward towards the end.
So I'm going to seize on the word confidence for a moment. Is that something that has strengthened over time for you, of that? Because we can say that we're confident, and then we can actually be we can actually be confident.
Yeah, I think it has. I don't know that when I wrote my first book, I don't think I would have had the confidence to create a whole world. It's not from scratch, because I'm borrowing from a lot of different places, and including little elements that feel like real places, or like places that once were. I might have tried it, but I don't know that I could have stuck with it and thought to myself, I can really do this. I don't know what's changed. I guess it's just practice and a certain amount of heedlessness, probably. Useful heedlessness.
Owen King is our guest. The name of the new book is The Curator. It is published by Scribner. I'm curious about the idea in the book, and I'll let you explain sort of how the book ultimately expands, because I don't want to give anything away that you don't want to give away. The story that you want to tell, of the points with Dora that you want to get to with Dee
Right.
and explore.
The core of her story is that she came from very prosperous circumstances, and her brother, who was a very influential figure in her life, was involved with, I think we would call, a secret society. As a young person, she was very interested in what he was doing, and she looked up to him, and something happened to him, and something happened to her whole family, and Dee wants to figure out why it happened and what it was all about. She doesn't really understand. She has only the barest outline of what occurred. This tragedy that occurred to her family has been a catastrophe in her life. It's thrown her to the bottom of life in this pretty pitiless urban environment. She's had a really tough go of it, and she's fought to survive, and she wants to understand what happened. And so the book takes that as its main line. She wants to solve that mystery, but the opportunity to solve that mystery has come about because there's been this revolution. So those two stories are twining around each other, right? She's trying to figure out what happened, and she's trying to keep herself safe, which is difficult because she doesn't have any resources. She doesn't have any family. She's on her own. And I think that's part of what makes her, I hope, easy to root for, is that she is somebody that has to do it all herself and does do it all herself. She's flawed, but she's very brave, and she's very smart, and she's very underestimated. But so that search that she's conducting runs parallel and through this revolution that's occurred in this city, where a group of university students and people who want a more democratic society have overthrown a monarchical government, but find their revolution stalled in some very strange and inexplicable ways. And I shouldn't say too much about that, because that kind of is
Right. Yeah.
such an important mechanism to the plot, is why is this revolution on pause? I think that the book really begins to reveal the answers to all these mysteries, towards the end of the first section of the book. Once we've met all our, we've been introduced to the place where this is happening, and we know
Right.
the circumstances, and we meet most of the important characters, pretty much all the important characters, and something is going on near the museum that tells us it's all wrong. Something very wrong is happening here, and Dora's going to have to contend with that. Dee is going to have to contend with that as well. There's a man next to the museum doing bad things. Let's put it that way.
It's a good way of putting it. Owen King is our guest on this week's book show. The name of the new book is The Curator. Given that you grew up with two novelists as parents, and not only novelists but successful novelists, what was that like when you had that moment where you say, okay, this is what, that you knew that that's what you wanted to do?
It took a while. I've told this story a few times, so I apologize to anybody that's heard it before, but I grew up with a whole host of advantages, obviously. I was very lucky, have been very lucky my whole life, but I knew that, or had the idea that, being a writer was a very legitimate profession, because my parents were successful, and I think that's an incredible advantage, because I think that a lot of people don't think it's a possible career choice. So that was very helpful to me. But what was a little bit challenging for me to get over was, I saw from a young age how hard my parents worked at the books they were writing. They would go to their offices just the way that other people's parents would go to their offices, except their offices were in the house, and they would be behind closed doors for hours and hours on end, and you would hear the typewriter keys at that time. You would hear them crashing down. And I felt as a young person that seemed very lonely and very daunting.
Mm.
And I loved to read. I've always been a reader, and I loved to write stories, but I was daunted by that kind of commitment for sure. And it wasn't until my college years or in that time that I was able to sort of say to myself, well, I really want to do this, and it really has to be, I really have to make the kind of commitment that they made. And so I would force myself, even when I didn't want to work, and to work whenever I had the time to do it. And I have to say, it wasn't probably until my late 20s that it became totally second nature. I mean, I was always working, but there were plenty of times where I was like, you got to work. And I was like, I don't want to. And I'd say, you got to work. At some point in my 20s, some sort of generator kicked in, and I never really had to do that anymore. And it was always something that I wanted to do, even when it was frustrating.
In the acknowledgments to the book, you mentioned the fact that the original short story was dedicated to Peter Straub, who is a magnificent writer and just a really
Yes.
cool guy, who obviously wrote a famous book with your father, and collaborated as you did recently with your father. What is that like, even to have those kind of influences around you with people like Peter, who were so incredibly good at what they did?
I mean, I would just say Peter was a huge inspiration, and I think that people talk justifiably so about what an incredible novelist he was and stylist. But I also think one thing you should never overlook is that he was such a generous person
Mm.
and assisted so many writers, helped so many people get their careers off the ground, read so many first novels and boosted them, and was just an extraordinarily charming and excellent guy. And I think that one of the examples that I hope he sets, and I know that he said, and I think that my parents said, is that you can be devoted to your art, but you can still, it's still important to be a generous member of your community, and you don't have to be tortured. It's
Right.
it can be fun, and you can be fun, and obviously sometimes it's challenging when you get stuck on a story or it's not working the way you want, but it's just one part of life.
Do you have to force yourself at times to say, okay, it's time to to leave the room, it's time to press save and walk away and go to the other aspects of my life?
I don't think it does, and I think it's because I try to, as much as possible, work early in the morning so that by the time it's time to quit, I'm like actually tired. I always wonder about writers who work late at night. You get that extra burst of energy or whatever at 1 in the morning, if after you started at 11. Like, what if they just write until 5 in the morning? Are they just vampires? So no, it's not that hard for me to stop. I think a good trick for me anyway is to stop while you still just have a little tiny bit left in the tank, and you know the next couple things you wanted to write, so you have some place to start the next day or the next week, or whatever the case may be, whenever you have time to write again.
You mentioned that you always try to do something different. This novel is now out. So what are you working on now?
I have a comic book, actually. So this is, again, something pretty different. A sequential comic book, as opposed to just it'll be a graphic novel eventually, but it's going to be an issue by issue thing that I'm writing with a novelist named Jesse Kellerman, who's an old friend
Oh, yeah.
and a very, very gifted writer of crime novels. And it's a California noir called Self-Help. It's been a lot of fun. We got the first 5 issues written, and the first 2 issues are drawn, and that will come out, probably early in the summer.
And that I guess scratches another itch for you, right?
It does. It does. I probably should do something. I should probably try to connect these things one of these days, but I keep feeling pulled to And I think it probably has something to do with trying to be an adventurous reader. I encounter things and I think to myself, well, if I could tell that kind of story or a story that had that feeling, how would I do it? What would it be like? What would my version of that be like? And it gets me thinking. And then when you're collaborating with somebody, as I have been with Jesse, someone very talented, they come up with ideas that you find inspiring, and hopefully you come up with ideas that they find inspiring, and it's a lot of fun. It's a nice bridge to the next thing that I write by myself.
What does it take? How do you define being an adventurous reader?
I try to read across genres, and I try to read across countries of origin. I try to read as many different voices as I possibly can. I always want to keep finding out different circumstances, but I love that. It's not like homework or something like
Right.
that.
No, that's a natural curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, every genre has something to offer. And I mean, but I also don't think there's anything wrong with, people who feel like, this kind of book isn't for me. That's all right. I mean, you only get one life and there's a lot of books, right? There's no problem with that. But I love reading all kinds of fiction, all kinds of nonfiction. I'll pick up just about anything if it catches my interest.
Well, the name of your new novel is The Curator. It is published by Scribner. Owen King, what a pleasure to have you on the program. I thank you so much for being with us. Very, very nice to have you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for talking about books.
The Book Show is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. Our producer is Sarah LeDuc. Our theme music is by Josh Ritter. Our executive producer is Alan Chartok. You can listen to The Book Show anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcasts. You may reach out to us by emailing book@wamc.org, and you may sign up for weekly book show updates by subscribing to our newsletter, Airwaves, and by following us on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week.